Hi there, I am Sean McGeever, and I'm going to go through one of the Talk Tuesdays, going through the Gospel of Mark, about how you might do talks through the Gospel of Mark for Young Life, Wildlife, whatever talks. And today we're going through chapter 12. So for chapter 12, there's actually a couple great stories that you could go through. One is the parable of the tenants, where it's a parable where Jesus is talking about how landowner keeps sending people, ends up sending his son, and they kill him. It's foreshadowing what they're going to do to Jesus. Could go through that. There's another great story, actually a really well-known story about what is the greatest commandment. This could be a great one for maybe a campaigner's lesson or something. The one that we're going to go through, or that I'm going to go through, is actually at the very end of the chapter, and it's about the scribes and the widow's offering. I'm actually doing this club talk in my club, at Pinnacles Club, Go Pioneers, on Monday. And so this is the talk that I chose to do. It's probably not one that you would hear a lot. That's why I kind of picked it for myself. Wanted to do one maybe that was a little trickier, a little unusual. So I'm doing this. But I think it's got a great message, and it follows up actually on what we just talked about in Mark 10. So I'm excited for this. So let me jump in. By the way, there's a couple of reasons why, at least 3 reasons why I really like this one. One is it does build upon what we talked about. In our talk, we talked about, in our last talk, we talked about Mark 10. We talked about the rich young ruler, which for us was kind of fits the mold of like what a sin talk is about. So this one, I think you'll see in a second, just picks up really nicely on that. The second reason why I like highlighting the story is this is a story of Jesus interacting with a woman, the widow, and I really like highlighting that. There's a lot of stories that we don't even realize it, but that we exclude women, so I like including this one. The third reason that I like going through this is that it's a story about Jesus interacting with the poor and the marginalized, and once again, there's tons of stories like this in the Bible. I want to highlight that as well. Kind of breaking it down, this story has 2 parts. I am going to start reading verse 38, where it talks about Jesus' attitude toward the scribes. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. But really kind of the main part that I want to highlight is Jesus' interactions with a widow. And so building upon that, I'll be touching back on the difference between the last club talk we heard and this one. In the last club talk, a rich young ruler, comes up and asks Jesus this questions. What must I do to inherit eternal life? So go back to Mark chapter 10, verse 17. You'll see that question. Jesus' answer is in verse 10, or in chapter 10, verse 21, is sell all that you have and give it to the poor. So that's kind of the setup. What must I do to inherit eternal life? That's what's going on in chapter 10. So that is in chapter 10. But now we meet someone in chapter 12 who lines up in a really interesting way. In chapter 10, we meet a man who's rich, who's young, and who's powerful. He's a ruler. In this story, we meet a woman who is poor, who's old, and is a widow. So get that. If you just look at him directly, we meet a person who's rich. Here in 10, here we meet a person who's poor. We meet a person in 10 who's young. In 12, we meet a person who's poor. In 10, we meet a ruler. In 12, we meet a widow, very low level in the community, not really no power at all. Anyway, they couldn't be more different. Basically, the total opposite sides of the spectrum when it came to all those different categories. And here's what the actual cool thing about it is this story has nothing to do with our place in life. Whether you're a rich young ruler or whether you're a poor old widow, it comes down to what is your response. And so we see in chapter 10, verse 22, his response, the rich young ruler's response, is that he doesn't want to give everything that he has, and so he goes away sorrowful. And then in this one, in verse 44, in chapter 12, verse 44, she puts in all that she has. So this is a story about response. This is a story about responding to Jesus. And in this case, she responds by giving everything that she has. Now, notice it's not about how much you have. It's not about the quantity of what you have. The point is about giving everything that I have. And Jesus actually measures response by what you end up keeping for yourself. I really like that. It's not about what you actually give. That's going to vary from person to person. It's what you end up keeping. And she ends up keeping nothing for herself. And so that's incredible. So anyway, Jesus measures a response by what you keep for yourself. So some people don't have a lot to give, a lot to offer, whether it's faith or trust or how much we really know about God or whatever. But Jesus wants us to focus on what we do have and giving it to him. So I love this concept here as I thought through it, and I'm pretty sure it's one I'm going to use, which is give what you have today. So some students might come in hearing about Jesus for the first time, thinking seriously about God for the first time, whatever. The challenge should be, would you give what you have today? And so that's the challenge. So the main point that I think I'm going to throw out in my club talk on Monday is this. Will you give all the faith that you have tonight to God? Whether that's a lot or a little, what matters is what you hold back. Give whatever trust you can give to God. Give it today. Give it tonight. Will you do that? So I think my challenge is going to be something on lines of that. So whether it's a person who's gone to church and really has a great relationship with God, will you give what you have to God today? Or maybe this is all new to you. Maybe you know very little. You have very little information about Jesus, very little trust. Maybe you have a really hard time trusting people. It takes a long time. Well, what you are able to give, will you give it today? So I like that. What does this show us about Jesus? It shows us that Jesus isn't impressed if you have a lot of money, if you have a lot of knowledge, if you have a lot of obedience. That's all great. Instead, what he really wants is wholeheartedness. You might have a lot of knowledge, but you don't give everything in your like capacity to think through things deeply and know about stuff. You don't devote that to God. You might have a lot of money or faith or whatever, but if you're not giving it all to God, you're holding something back. And so what God really wants is wholeheartedness. Another thing that we learn about Jesus is that Jesus was also, like this woman, poor his entire life. There's two people basically in this story. There's the scribes and then there's the widow. The scribes were, wearing these robes and they're, just going around kind of showing off how much money they could put and stuff. Jesus was more like the widow. He didn't have a lot to show. He didn't dress fancy. He didn't have really any money. He was a lot more like the widow than the people who were walking around excited about the different titles that they'd be called. So what does this have to do with our life? Don't underestimate what you have to give. God doesn't really care too much about the quantity of what you have. So don't worry about the amount that you have to give to God. What God is interested in is if we just want to give ourselves wholeheartedly to God. A couple technical details. One would be the scribes. These are like literally professional biblical scholars in Jesus's era. They're technically poor because they didn't have anything to sell or offer, but people would support them really generously. So they tended to have quite a bit. In verse 38, it talks about how they would wear long robes and they liked greetings. So apparently scribes in those days would wear something that was kind of like a uniform that everyone would go oh, those are the scribes. Those are those people. They're the experts. And they would call them, I looked it up, and what they would call them titles like rabbi and father and master. And they apparently loved these titles. So they liked having those titles and they loved wearing the robes and kind of showing off. It says in verse 40 that they would devour widows' houses, which is ironic because the next person we're going to meet is a widow. And not ironic, it's just really sad that these are the exact people that would take advantage of this widow who's going to show such great faith. But anyway, in the Old Testament, it's super clear that the people of God are to take care of widows and the poor and the marginalized. I have some verses in this handout here, but Exodus 22, look at that. There's a bunch of other verses in Isaiah. It's all throughout the Bible. But these are the exact people that the scribes should have known that they're supposed to take care of. I mean, that's the irony. They're kind of flaunting that they're really important and that they get these titles and they have these robes and they don't mind all the perks. And they knew the Bible better, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible better than anyone. And they would have known the commands to be able to take care of the widows and the poor. And they're actually the ones that were disobeying those laws worse than anyone. Hopefully it's not like that today in our world, but maybe it is. The very people that know a lot about the Bible are actually doing the worst job of living it out. So anyway, that's a little bit about what they should have been up to and what they weren't doing. There's a treasury, so they're in the temple area. They're not in the inner courts or anything like that, but they're in the it says they're in the temple at Jerusalem, and they put their money into basically like this receptacle that would have been kind of like a can. Some accounts say it's like almost like a trumpet, if you will, or kind of like a tuba. You almost like throw it into this metal thing, and they could, it would kind of collect in the bottom of a basin. And then it goes into these 2 copper coins. They're obviously ancient coins, but 2 of these coins would end up being called what's called a lepton, is the word that's used there. And 1 lepton was equal to 1/64th of a day's wages. So 1 lepton was 1/64th of a day's wages, and it took 2 coins to equal a lepton. So, I mean, just throwing numbers out there, maybe you make $64 in a day, 1/64th would be $1. So 2 coins would be equivalent to like maybe kind of like $1. So not a lot of money, and that's all this woman had to her name. And so she puts all of that in there. Also, we know that she didn't need to put both coins in. Her sacrifice, her offering for that visit to the temple would have been fine to just give 1. She could have just given 1, but she actually takes all that she has and she puts it in there. And what Jesus says is that out of her poverty, she put in everything that she had, all that she had to live on. And so, and Jesus commends her for that. So I'm going to build on that just for some illustrations. I have this idea that I'm going to do on Monday, which is that at some point in my talk, I'm going to give out a bunch of coins. It won't be too hard if I give everyone, I say, hey, everyone, take at least 2 pennies. And I want you to hold on to those. This will be good also for wildlife, just giving people something to hold, being tactile, engaging, all that. So you pass around maybe a bucket or just some coins. Heck, you can even just like throw them out into the crowd. But 2 coins, say, hey, take it, make sure everyone has at least 2 coins. I have something I want you to do with them at the end. Then at the end of the talk, I probably walk over, and once again, kind of to make a display of it a little bit, with a bucket. I'm going to say, hey, at the end of the night, I'm going to pray here in just a moment, but I'm going to put this bucket over by the door. When you leave club, when you leave my house, I want you to take at least 1 of these coins and put it in there. In fact, you could, earlier in the talk, you could talk about how the scribes, they would put like tons of money, make a big show of it, make it loud. Oops. I guess that was kind of loud, kind of missed here. But they would do that. So you could use that to make your point. And then when you leave tonight, walk over and say, hey, I want you guys to I only want you to put 1 of your coins in. So drop it in and hold on to the last one. And I want you to hold on to this as you leave club, as you go into your car, as you go home tonight, put it in your pocket, find it in a place, or put it in a place where you're going to find it later. And I want you to ask yourself, what would it be like for me to give everything to God? I want you to think about that now, but I actually only want you to put 1 coin in by the door, and I want you to keep 1 for later so that you can ask yourself when you have a little bit more time, maybe before you fall asleep or whatever it is, I want you to think about what would it be like to give everything that I am to God? So I think it's a great way to just ask for a response. Then one other thing you could do, kind of building upon that the scribes like to wear robes, you could just make a point about kind of like uniforms, how people look at the exterior, but it's really the interior. There's a million ways to do this. But one way I thought about it was the different kind of uniforms that people wear. These days we don't really wear robes too often, but maybe like a sports uniform, or maybe a uniform from work if you have a job, or you can get one from a job that you've had, how people think you or something like that. I just went in my closet. As a basketball coach, so go Pinnacle Basketball. I said, when you wear this, people think, oh, you're an athlete, you're in sports, you must have a game or something like that. Well, that tells you a little bit about me, but it doesn't really tell you about the insides of who I am. And so the idea of how a uniform kind of communicates a little bit about us, but usually our insides, who we really are demonstrated through our actions and through our words. And this is what God is really interested in, which is the response of our life, not the outfit that we put on. We don't need Christian t-shirts, Young Life t-shirts. That's not what it's about. It's about who we are and who we change from the inside out. So anyway, that's it. I got my club talk. Oh, also repping a little of this. I kind of put, I'm thinking Rory's going to win. I don't know. If you made it this far, you're probably not interested in golf. Probably maybe interested in club talks, but it's Masters Week, and that's a pretty cool week for me. Pretty excited about that. So, yeah, that's it. I hope you have a great talk. I'm looking forward to mine. on Monday. We'll see what story I use. I'm trying to think of, I don't know, I might use a uniform illustration. I might talk about, I don't know, jobs I got, money. I'm not sure. I'm praying about my intro, but the intro isn't usually the most important part of it. It has a lot more to do with the scriptures, open up the scriptures, telling them about Jesus and challenging them to respond. So I hope you have a great club talk, and I hope that this was helpful. So I'll talk to you later. Bye.